This car shouldn't have won the 24 Hours of Le Mans. It had less power, the team had less experience, and to top it all off, its rotary engine was deemed illegal. The Mazda 787B had every single odds stacked against it, yet somehow it beat powerhouses like Porsche, Mercedes, and Jaguar at the world's greatest race. So how does a car that should have never lined up on the grid become Japan's first ever Le Mans Gold? Well, to figure that out, you have to look at how Mazda even got into motor racing. You see, Mazda started making cars way back in the 1930s. Well, sort of. They were mostly motorcycles with truck beds attached to them, like the Mazda Go. But over the next 3 decades, they began to sell more and more passenger cars. And where there's cars, there's racing. Mazda's first foray into racing was in the 1960s, but it wasn't started by Mazda executives or factory engineers. It started at Mazda Auto Tokyo, Mazda's largest dealership in the capital of Japan. Yes, that's right, a group of bored dudes at a dealership would go on to be the reason that Mazda competed at the legendary 24 Hours of Le Mans. But I'm getting ahead of myself. Global endurance racing hadn't really crossed their minds. These dudes just wanted to hoon some cars. One of those dudes working at the dealership was Takayashi Ohashi, and he and all his colleagues were captivated by the latest car to roll into Mazda's showroom, the Mazda Cosmo 110S. The Cosmo was a beautiful rear-wheel drive coupe with a 4-speed manual powered by a twin rotary engine, one that made nearly 110 horsepower out of just 1 liter. This was the first ever production rotary engine from Mazda, and with its sub 2,100 pound curb weight, it was no slouch. Ohashi saw that car and knew this was the perfect car to go racing in. So Ohashi and his colleagues formed a racing team with the dealership's approval. They called it Mazda Sports Corner, and they would take factory Mazda cars, soup them up, and hit the circuit. Of course, it didn't take long for the Mazda executives to figure out what was going on, and they decided to have a word with Mr. Ohashi. But to everyone's surprise, they weren't mad. In fact, they were pumped. It turns out Mazda Corporate and Mazda Sports Corner were aligned in their interests. The Sports Corner group wanted to race Mazdas, and the Mazda execs wanted to prove that the rotary engine was capable of beating the piston engine. So Mr. Ohashi, now the racing manager for Mazda Sports Corner, was given the go-ahead to assemble a super team and take the Cosmo SP110s to the track. They called it the Rotary Avengers. No, they didn't call it that, I'm sorry. But on the team were real rotary superheroes like Kenichi Yamamoto, the chief engineer for the rotary engine at Mazda, and alongside him Kunio Matsuda and Takaharu Kobe Kobayakawa, members of the legendary 47 Samurai team that initially developed the Mazda rotary engine. Together they souped up the Cosmos 10A rotary engine with custom intakes and aluminum housings, resulting in the tiny 1-liter rotary making 130 horsepower at 7,000 RPM, all motor. And all that was left was to race. So race they did, and the race that really put them on the map was the 1968 Marathon de la Route. For context, the Marathon de la Route was deemed one of the toughest racing events in history, and in 1968 it was more commonly referred to as the 84 Hours of Nürburgring. The Mazda Sports Corner team entered 2 Cosmos into the race, followed in tow by truckloads of factory parts direct from Mazda, along with a team of engineers. And as for the drivers, well, the first car was driven by 3 veteran Japanese racing drivers, but the other car, however, was driven by an all-Belgian team, a team that was already experienced with the 84 Hours of Nürburgring. And it was a hell of a race, with the Cosmos holding 4th and 5th positions out of 44 cars. But late in the race, the Japanese team went off track and into the Eiffel Forest, crashing the car and retiring from the race. As for Team Belgium, well, they took the Mazda Cosmo across the finish line and placed 4th overall. It was a huge result, especially for a rookie team, solidifying that the rotary engine was a true contender in racing. As for the Japanese team that crashed, well, they could have gotten compensation for their injuries if they called our sponsor, Morgan & Morgan. This is Bob. Bob is a mechanic working 12-hour shifts on rusty jalopies for a shop with 2 stars on Google. Bob ain't a rich man, but he's a good man. So when a careless shop owner leaves 5W40 all over the floor and Bob slips, falls, and lands butt first into a 00 Phillips screwdriver, he needs somebody who can fight on his side and pay for that expensive tear in his tush. That somebody is Morgan & Morgan. And Morgan. Oh, wait, no, there's only two Morgan. Morgan & Morgan is America's largest injury law firm with more than 800 lawyers and 4,000 case staff ready to fight for your behind. But Bob is worried because he doesn't have the cash to pay for expensive legal fees. But worry no more, because Morgan & Morgan doesn't charge you any sign-up fees or other upfront costs. The fee is free unless you win. But Bob still feels bad. He doesn't want to sue his boss, even if his boss hasn't actually paid him real money for the last 6 months. But Bob, when you sue for an injury, you're not suing your D-bag boss, you're suing his insurance company, who have way too much money as it is. There's no reason to feel bad for getting the compensation you deserve. So if you've been a victim in a car accident, medical malpractice, workplace injury, or any other personal injury, hit the link in the description to get Morgan & Morgan to fight for you. Bob did, and he sure is thankful Morgan & Morgan had his back and his butt. The following year, they entered the same race, but this time in the Mazda R100. This was the next evolution of rotary experiment at Mazda, and once again, they got results, finishing 5th and 6th behind 4 Porsche 911s. But a few years later, the Marathon de la Route was no more. And that was because there was a new endurance race taking over the world, a race that would go on to become the crown jewel of motorsport. The 24 Hours of Le Mans. I think you can see where this is headed. Mazda's rotary debuted at the 1970 Le Mans 24 Hours, but it wouldn't be until 1973 that they saw their biggest breakthrough. Mazda took the very first all-Japanese racing team to Le Mans. That team was Sigma Automotive Racing Development, a team that you might better know as SARD, and Sigma Automotive was fully backed by Mazda Auto Tokyo and the Sports Corner team. The car was a MC73 prototype that used a built 12A twin rotary engine from Mazda Auto. And well, it was quick. But for Le Mans, it's not just about being quick. 79 laps in, and they suffered transmission failure. 12 hours into a 24-hour race. And although it wasn't the result they wanted, it was more evidence that there was potential there. But if they wanted to win at Circuit de la Sarthe, then they needed durability as much as they did power. They came right back in 1974 with the legendary Yojiro Terada behind the wheel of the Mazda MC74. Terada was one of Japan's most recognized racing drivers and would later become known as Mr. Le Mans. But unfortunately, the 1974 Le Mans was not the one that he was named after. The MC74 came dead last, and all of the doubters of the rotary engine became psychics overnight. But let's be honest, Mazda had been dealing with haters for years, so they vowed to come back even stronger, and this time, they weren't gonna rush it. Kind of like how we didn't rush our Plus B and Chill merch. Super comfortable shirts, hand-drawn design, and packed and shipped by yours truly. The best way to support Albon, after hitting subscribe, of course. Anyways, Mazda would use the next 5 years to develop their engine and car, nail down the strategy, and get their drivers ready to fight. But they realized, in order to develop the best race car to win worldwide, they needed to make sure they could win at home first. So they developed the Mazda RX-3 for racing, a street car-based platform that they could quickly iterate on. And it didn't take long for that to pay off, with the RX-3 winning 1st, 2nd, and 3rd at the 72 Fuji Grand Prix, proving that Nissan's old Skylines were washed up compared to the ever-evolving rotary. After they won at home, they sent the RX-3 to Europe and Australia to continue winning there, but it wasn't until 1978 that Mazda would develop the model that would give them the confidence to win anywhere. That model, of course, was the RX-7. The FB platform RX-7 took wins at the Rolex 24 in Daytona and the 12 Hours of Sebring, but it was in IMSA that Mazda developed a true monster. They were winning races left, right, and center. In fact, the IMSA RX-7 was such a capable platform that Mazda used it to create the 252i, their entrant into the 1979 24 Hours of Le Mans. And Mazda was ready to show the world that last time was just a fluke. That 252i brapped out of the pits and blasted down Circuit de la Sarthe, entering its hot lap session, and it looked good. This was Mazda's moment to prove that not only were they the pioneers of the rotary engine, it was gonna lay a smackdown on the piston engines of the world. Those last 5 years of development, those race wins in Japan and Australia, all culminated into this qualifying lap. And when the 252i crossed the finish line, its lap time was written into history as not fast enough. They set a time of 4 minutes, 18 seconds, 0.88, 0.7 seconds too slow to qualify. All of that buildup, all of that anticipation, and Mazda had just failed to make the starting grid at Le Mans. Now, to be clear, slower cars qualified and raced that year, but Le Mans is a grouped race, and being the slowest car in the IMSA class meant that Mazda Auto Tokyo was gonna have to pack up and head back home. The team was left feeling embarrassed, ashamed, defeated even. Their Dorito Frankenstein of an engine once again fed the egos of piston lovers everywhere. But if this is a story about anything, it's one of unfaltering, borderline reckless persistence. So the team went back to Japan, regrouped, and doubled down on engineering and development. And to show that they were really serious, Mazda moved the racing team out of that dealership in Tokyo and made room for them at Mazda headquarters in Hiroshima. From now on, this was Mazda's in-house racing department. And if it was in-house, it needed a new name. That name was Mazdaspeed. And Mazdaspeed had one objective: revenge at the 24 hours of Le Mans. But as we know by now, winning Le Mans was no simple task, especially now that they were racing against the clock. You see, in 1982, FISA, the board in charge of the race, had just changed up the rules, shaking up the group classification. This meant that there was a new top tier of cars about to hit the grid, Group C. Now, Group C classifications are ridiculously complex and frankly deserve an entire video, but for the sake of Mazda's story, they had their sights set on the new Group C Junior class. It was a good starting point for them to build from and hopefully gain the knowledge they needed for the top Group C class. It also meant that they now had to build a dedicated prototype in time to race at Le Mans. No more production car-based racers. This was going to be one car built for one weekend. Mazda commissioned the design of the car to a shop near Fuji Speedway called Mooncraft. Their first prototype to come out of the lab was the 717C, and at its heart, the 13B twin rotary engine. Mazda managed to finish and enter two 717C prototypes into the 83 Le Mans, and with zero expectation of what was going to happen, the cars both finished the 24 hours and came in 12th and 18th place. Now, before you scoff at that was 12th and 18th. Overall, the 717Cs came first and second in the junior Group C class. And the cherry on top, none of the other cars even made it to the finish line. This was truly poetic justice, Mazda's first class victory, and they absolutely stomped the competition. The plan was working, and Mazda now had the data to go even faster. The 717C was plenty quick, but it lacked downforce. At full chat, all 6 drivers genuinely thought the car was gonna fly off the track, an occurrence that isn't too uncommon at Le Mans. The team then learned that rivals like Nissan and Toyota were planning on moving to turbochargers and V6 engines, which meant that the little 13B rotary was also going to have to get much beefier to keep up. So the Mazdaspeed team developed the March 84G, a fire-breathing twin-turbo 13B that would race at the 1984 Fuji Endurance race. But in testing, the turbocharger failed and they had horrendous fuel economy. So that prototype definitely wasn't going to France. And with the race coming up fast, Mazda needed an answer. But ditching the rotary engine wasn't an option, and they should be glad that they didn't, because the solution was actually quite the opposite. You see, Mazda had 2 full-time engineers at the Hiroshima plant working solely on the racing rotary engine, and the 2 of them looked at each other and said, why don't we just add a 3rd rotor? It was such a simple solution to their power problem, and technically should have been much more reliable than turbocharging. There was just one problem. The project was already getting quite expensive, and they definitely did not have company approval to work on an entirely new idea for an engine. But their boss, Noriyuki Kuryo, was as devoted to the Le Mans mission as anyone else. So after the department closed for the day, he snuck in the engineers to develop the engine after hours, a gamble that could have easily gotten them all fired. And as the engineers worked on the 3-rotor power in secret, Kuryo-san worked to convince the Mazda executives to approve a new racing engine. And by the time they finally got the official green light from Mazda, well, they already had one. It was called the 13G, and it was a naturally aspirated peripheral port 3-rotor engine with electronic fuel injection, which made 450 horsepower and revved to 9,500 RPM. To put that into context, the 13B at the previous Le Mans only made around 300 horsepower. So now, with the new power plant chosen for the next race car, they just needed a new chassis. By now it was 1985 and the 84 Le Mans had ended quite poorly for Mazda. Not only did they not win their class, they lost to a team using Mazda engines, just in a much better chassis, so this 1985 car needed to be perfect. And to do that, Mazda commissioned the legendary Nigel Stroud. Yes, the same Nigel Stroud who was designing cars like this, or this at Lotus. And together, they developed the Mazda 757, a carbon Kevlar body over a honeycomb monocoque powered by, of course, that three-rotor engine. That car would debut at the 1986 Le Mans 24, and just 6 hours into the race, transmission failure left the first 757 broken down on the side of the circuit, and then just 5 hours after that, the gearbox failed in the second car as well. They tried again in 1987, and while one car went down with an engine failure, the second car finished 7th overall, winning the IMSA GTP class. Mazda still showed tremendous promise, but winning your class was one thing, winning overall was another. The 757 just wasn't enough to truly get the crown, and Mazda wanted the whole kit and caboodle. So Mazdaspeed started developing the 767. And lucky for them, Mazdaspeed had just landed a sponsorship with one of Japan's largest clothing companies, Renown. And with the sponsor dollars came 6 more engineers, along with a much more generous budget from Mazda HQ, which meant that now Mazda had the Skrilla to develop not a 3, but a 4-rotor engine. It was the new 13J, and it made 500 horsepower naturally aspirated. But there's a caveat. Even though a 4-rotor today is considered the ultimate engine by Rob Dom stans like myself, well, it wasn't the same in the late 80s. 500 horsepower wasn't a convincing jump over the 3-rotor's 450 horsepower, but it was definitely heavier and longer, throwing off the balance of the chassis. So for 1988, Mazda entered 2 767s and 1 757 just to hedge their bets. And well, they placed 15th, 17th, and 19th overall. Better than a DNF, I guess? It was a step back for Mazda, and certainly not the outcome that their sponsors had hoped for, so it was time to iterate and optimize fast. The next successor was the 767B, which rocked a 9,000 RPM peripheral ported 4-rotor, making 630 horsepower. A big jump in power, yes, but still heavy. And well, the results didn't really change at the next Le Mans. They needed something bigger, something more extraordinary to get that overall win. So in a full circle fashion, Kobi Kobayakawa, the engineer who developed the very first rotary engine ever, was appointed as manager of this development team. And this group of rotary geniuses would go on to produce an engine more capable than any rotary that came before it, the R26B. It was smaller, it was lighter, it was more fuel efficient, and it made more power than the 13B, G, or J 900 horsepower at 10,000 RPM. It genuinely seemed like some sort of wizardry, but the science was there. 3 spark plugs per rotor, peripheral intake ports, ceramic apex seals. But even though they were confident in their creation, this was a 24-hour endurance race. So they made a decision to detune those numbers down to about 700 horsepower at 9,000 RPM. And with that engine done, now there was a chassis to focus on, once again delegated to the legendary Nigel Stroud. And Nigel, he didn't cut a single corner. It was a carbon monocoque chassis with clever designs like a downforce increasing front-mounted radiator, aerodynamic doors that efficiently moved air to the rear ducts, cooling the engine and the brakes, and a tried and true Porsche transaxle married to the R26B. This new car was dubbed the 787, and it was truly the most promising race car to ever come out of Mazda headquarters. There was just one little problem. I'm sorry, did I say little? No. One devastating problem that Mazda had somehow completely missed. FISA, the governing body, had just announced an entirely new set of regulations, and these regulations stated that all future Group C cars would require 3.5-liter engines to compete in the highest class. The newly developed, very expensive 2.6-liter R26B rotary was technically banned from racing at Le Mans. But thankfully, those regulations would be next year's problem, because this year still raced with the old rules. Mazdaspeed would just have to deal with FISA later. For now, they entered the 1990 race with 3 cars, 2 787s and 1 of the older 767B. And you would imagine, with everything once again on the line, the threat of being banned looming over their heads, they finally shaped up and they came in 12th place. In the old 767B, those 787s that Mazda invested every dime into, well, they didn't even finish the race. One car had an oil leak while the other had an electrical failure which led to a fire, which if you own an FDRX7 is probably pretty familiar to you. Regardless, that was it. It was game over for Mazda. They failed their absolute last attempt at making the rotary engine the crown king of racing. Obviously, there was absolutely no chance that Mazdaspeed was going to switch to a 3.5-liter piston engine after how far they came. But the racing manager, Ohashi-san, told them to not give up. He told the team to continue focusing on developing the car, and he would find a way to get them into the race. But even if he managed to get them in, this time it was really the last dance for Mazda. Losing at the 1991 Le Mans would mean failure forever, so Mazdaspeed prepped for the race by updating the 787 formula. The team brought in Takao Kijima, the engineer that had developed the chassis for the FDRX7. They developed carbon composite brakes the first time ever at Le Mans, and they made a continuously variable intake manifold, a wacky looking system for the time, with intake runners that would extend to generate more low-end torque and then shorten for high RPM power. They called this new iteration of the 787 the 787B, and while the engineers were building the 787B, Ohashi-san was busy politicking with FISA. Now, registration for the 1991 Le Mans was at its lowest in years. Manufacturers and racing teams were just not convinced by the new regulations, and they weren't confident that they could deliver a competitive car. It wasn't just Mazda affected. Almost everyone had to make a brand new prototype to race. So Ohashi-san, along with other racing managers, debated with FISA, arguing that a small turnout would be an embarrassment for the world's greatest race. And eventually, FISA agreed, and a compromise was made. The new 3.5-liter engine regulations would be placed into the Category 1 classification, and those cars would be put at the front of the grid. The cars following the old regulations would now be considered Category 2, which had to follow a fuel restriction formula not required by the C1 cars. It was a complicated solution, but the only thing that mattered was that Mazda was taking the 787B to race, and this time they were ready. The rest of the grid filled up as well, some new cars, but mostly cars from the old regulations, and well, most of them were still more powerful than our little Mazda. The Sauber Mercedes C11 had around 730 horsepower, the 1990 winning Jaguar XJR12 was back with 730 horsepower as well, and of course, Porsche came with their famous 962C making 750 horsepower. Mazdaspeed entered 3 cars, the original 787 starting at 30th, a 787B starting 23rd, and the other 787B starting 19th. It wasn't the best place to qualify at, but was a lot better than not racing at all. And at 4 p.m. on a fine French afternoon, the cars crossed the line and the race officially started. Immediately, the 3 Sauber Mercedes C11s led the pack, while the Porsches and Jaguars fell behind in an effort to balance fuel efficiency and lap time. The number 55 787B ran as consistent as could be. The power to weight advantage and the fuel efficiency of the R26B at high RPMs proved to be hugely effective, and slowly but surely they worked their way through the field and found themselves in 4th place, less than halfway through the race. Then the Porsche broke down, and the number 55 Mazda moved up to 3rd. All the while, the other 787B wasn't far behind, making its way up to 8th. Then one of the Saubers broke down, taking Michael Schumacher's team out of the race. And that orange and green 787B now found itself in 2nd place, breathing down the neck of the C11 in 1st. But that C11 was fast. So fast that it would take a miracle for Mazda to catch up. But they could taste it at this point. They wanted this so bad, and for so long, there was no option but to push. So they chased. They chased, waiting for the chance to overtake, and that's when dedicated preparation met fortuitous opportunity. With just 2 hours left, the lead C11 pitted due to high water temps. Their alternator bracket had sheared off, and in doing so snapped the water pump drive belt. The Sauber team tried to figure it out, but the block was damaged in such a way that they just couldn't put it back together. And after 11 minutes of the Sauber team fussing around, the number 55 Mazda flew by the pits and took the lead. The crowd erupted. The absolute underdogs of the race, the little rotary engine from Mazda, was on the brink of an overall victory for the first time ever. The Sauber never made it back on track, and when the 24 hours were up, that orange and green 787B cruised across the finish line. Not a single hiccup the whole race. Mazda won, and proved that their rotary had the formula for endurance, consistency, reliability, and fuel efficiency. Imagine that, a rotary engine in the same sentence as reliability and fuel efficiency. And while it was the first time for a rotary victory at Le Mans, it was also the last time. Because the very next year, the new regulations went into full effect, and the 787B, along with the rotary engine, was relegated to endurance racing history. But I'll tell you what, I know I've gone on and on about the rotary and how it was the secret weapon for Mazda, but that's really just not true. That Mazda team, the one that started as a bunch of bored dudes in a dealership and grew to a factory-backed global racing powerhouse, used something else far more valuable: persistence. An unwavering faith that no matter how far behind they were or how high the odds were stacked against them, they could win it all as long as they believed they could. Thanks for watching. If you like this video, you'll love our video on the history of Le Mans. Join us on Discord to chat about this episode and subscribe if you haven't already. I'll see you in the next one.